arrogant, throwing fits, ripping shit, tearing it, imperative. Then I'm killing this mic no matter where I live. These derelict rappers acting a fool, this embarrassing is flagrant. That's the nature of this entertainment, and we can't even change it. Guilty before arraignment, now the system tainted. But when we speak, they all laugh at us, and y'all wonder why I'm lacking trust. Trying to fight a giant with attorneys that can back them up. That's church versus science, both sides start acting up. I'm late on my assignment, hopping up a mile high, climbing, obviously never silent. New alignment, I'm defined, can I describe it? Used to describe it as a young graffiti artist. Before the beard, I always got carded. At every bar, even though my bar's been the hardest. The scars on my face, and I ain't always been the smartest, but I'll show you where my heart is. I said I'll show you where my heart is. I can show you where my heart's at. See it on my sleeve, even if the beat stops, my soul will not leave. If I never stood tall, nobody will ever see. I can show you where my heart's at. See it on my sleeve, I can show you where my heart's at. See it on my sleeve, even if the beat stops, my soul will not leave. If I never stood tall, nobody will ever see. I can show you where my heart's at. See it on my sleeve, I can show you where my...
The type of guy that would ride with the breeze. I'm higher than most people, I'm cold and icicle freeze. I'm liking to Mike Tyson, I'm a bison, a beast. I'm hot like Jamaica, like right by the beach. My pops is from a spot where they're fighting for peace. 8 years old, out there watching people fight in the streets. All these sirens only make the violence increase. Yeah, we're still not loving police. It's that bright young American, nice, dumb, arrogant. Tight on a mic, but he might need a therapist. Heart full of kerosene, head full of fairy tales. Said that you're my homie, you don't know me, but I know you very well. Roll back on some West Coast shit. This whole track is wetter than your dress code kiss. About to hit the track, running on some retro fit. I guess so lit, I guess so bitch, now let's go.
I can show you where my heart's at. See it on my sleeve, even if the beat stops, my soul will not leave. If I never stood tall, nobody...
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new and improved Husker Hour. Sponsored by Sports Nonsense and Whiskey. Hanging with my guy, Cam. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. I got my C4 strawberry zero sugar Starburst flavor.
All right, good. Cheers, my man. Nice
Cheers.
to have you tonight.
Yeah.
He is MIA, doing a little family vacay. He made a foolish mistake that this was going to be a Nebraska show this week with him not being around, and so we're going to go ahead and do him justice. Huskers for an hour and a half. Get ready, people.
That's right. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about it from now to the end of the show. So any Bronco fans, any CU Buff fans, we're sorry. You know, and especially the CU Buff fans, we're sorry, but you're going to lose. We're sorry. You know, we're sorry. You know,
I'm not really sorry either.
In this house, Nebraska rules.
Love it. Love it. And easy, guys. We're not actually going to talk Nebraska Huskers the whole hour, okay? Just calm down.
Yeah.
Probably lost like half the people that were ready to watch tonight. If you hear this, come on back. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Or they made the conscious decision to watch it through Twitter, which they know they can't comment on.
Right.
Right.
Just yelling at their screen
Right.
the whole time.
Right.
Easy, Pinky, when you watch this. We're just playing. But, you know, we had to support a little bit. You know, you made the mistake. You mentioned it. Just so we're clear, real men do go for 2. So, you know, win or lose, that's a man move. Let's just be clear about that.
I was going to say the real reason Pinky was not here is because he knew we were wearing Husker red, so he knew he didn't want to show up.
Right, exactly. Let's be honest though, red looks good on everybody. If people would just wisen up, it just looks good on everybody. So it's a clean look, guys. Come on.
Not for us today.
Yeah. Quick note on Nebraska though. I do want to give a big shout out to the Huskers for making sure CU had a sellout game in Boulder, September 7th, 12th, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Huskers fans, for making sure CU could pack that stadium. Always nice to see the Sea of Red travel. So well done.
And also a failure for the AD, by the way.
When are they going to learn, man?
We have to slide that in there. I mean, obviously, I get what he was trying to come across with. I get it. From a fan perspective, you want to make sure that you are packing that stadium with the fans that are repping the university or repping the team. Like, I 100% get that. But if you think for a moment, and this isn't just a Nebraska thing, but if you think for a moment you are going to block off an entire game for, like not even one fan that's a Nebraska fan to go into that game, you're fooling yourself. You just
If there's one fan base you don't challenge, it's Nebraska. They travel well. If you haven't noticed, Big 10, Big 12, Big 8, Nebraska travels well. So if you challenge them that they're not going to be able to go, they'll just pay double the ticket price and force their way in anyways. So, Colorado, good luck. Good luck.
Yeah. And that is going to be the extent of our Nebraska conversation for the rest of the show. Anyway,
we're good now. We're good now.
So, what else you got for us today, Caleb?
So I want to start off with a couple quick hitter topics. We're going to discuss some rivalries, team versus player kind of aspects and stuff like that as we get going. But some big news contract-wise that's happened over the last week. Going back a couple days, Kylian Mbappe, for those that do follow soccer, football to some others in the world, is being offered by the Saudi League $1.1 billion. 336 roughly million of that is to the transfer fee to PSG, Paris Saint-Germain, his current team. And the other 776 million would go to Mbappe for him to go ahead and pocket. 1-year deal. Just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
When you put numbers into perspective. However, and I've talked about this with a couple people, and they're like, that's stupid money. Why would you do that? Well, one, because the people that are giving out that money, it's pocket change. Mm-hmm. If we're being completely honest, the sovereign fund of the Saudis is very, very good, and that is pocket change to them. And if you're really trying to grow a sports league, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can home grow talent and make it attractive for people to come by the level of skill that you continuously develop. Or you can just go ahead and buy the talent to come over and start creating it that way. The Saudis have decided they're going to spend a bunch of money to create. They did it with Live Golf. It put the PGA in a position they couldn't do anything about it. And look, let's be honest. They bought the PGA. They run the PGA now. Regardless of what anybody wants to say, they're the sole sponsor. Their dude is the head board member. They run the PGA now. They bought golf. They have since decided that they want to get into other ventures. They've been pretty big in soccer here over in Europe for the last 10 plus years, buying up some major teams, Manchester City being one of the biggest ones. Just went on to win the Champions League, the Premier League, and they had the trifecta. Now I'm drawing a blank. Apologize. But so Man City, they built them up into a contender. Now they're trying to build their homegrown league. So interesting to see how that goes down. Whether or not Mbappe accepts the 1-year deal. Transfers, I'm not too familiar with. I got to do some research to see how much say Mbappe really has and how that'll all happen, because I know he's kind of basically a free agent at the end of this season. So it'll be interesting to see if he accepts the 1-year deal for $776 million and then goes to Real Madrid or somebody like that, like it's been rumored he would do anyways. But in the grand scheme of things, how do you feel about the sovereign wealth fund and the contract and what they're trying to do in the sports world overall?
I mean, solely from the contract perspective, it's absurd. I mean, like, and when we'll have this conversation just throughout. With this conversation, just how far things are ballooning. And I think that as crazy as it is, like as crazy of the fact that you have sports that are ballooning contract-wise, it's really important to understand that's also market. Like, as ridiculous as it is, like the way the market is always going to go up, or the market's going to fluctuate one way or another, right? I mean, we had the conversation ad nauseum in terms of the running backs, and I think that that's one of the things that, like in terms of why they had this Zoom meeting, was probably to have this conversation about, okay, since the running back position has been depreciated or devalued, how can we get to that type of level to where we can get the $20 million a year, the $30 million a year those types of deals that are ballooning for guys like wide receivers and quarterbacks, or even to the $50 million a year now for quarterbacks. And we'll talk about the quarterbacks later, but it's crazy to think about a actual sport offering $1 billion. Like it's
just wild.
So I mean, like we talk about the market and rightfully so. Again, like rightfully so. I mean, that is exactly, what it is that you want. You want the market to always continue to go up, and if it is paying, I mean, you should always do the smart thing as a customer, business person, to take that kind of deal, and so I think that it's just still crazy to me though how there's just this sport that is offering $1 billion, just because you just never thought it was certainly possible. But the way things are ballooning, it should never surprise anyone anymore.
Agreed. Well, and I think the other thing that this shouldn't surprise people is because Mbappe is widely considered one of the top 3 dudes in the world right now when it comes to soccer. And before Messi came over to Inter Miami and made the move to the MLS, this same Saudi league offered him 1.6 straight to his pocket for a 3-year deal, with added incentives on the back end. Messi decided that's not the move he wanted to make long-term for his family, and some other things, would rather be in Miami, so he went that route. But this isn't like this is the first time they've offered this to somebody. It just might be the first time somebody finally takes them up on it.
And the other thing too, I think that now, Grant, I don't follow soccer as much, as the next guy or anything like that. But one of the things I at least have followed enough was, I mean, and granted, you're going to get this for any other sport, but like is soccer in general, in terms of transfers or people that are moving from, I guess you could say country, but like basically like
sure.
team to team in soccer, it also feels a little bit like a turnstile. And I think that people, have a tendency to forget that a little bit. I mean, the only guy that I can think of that kind of comes to mind, and I say it comes to mind for me, is like Wayne Rooney, like the guy that was in England and he spent like his entire, year, if you will, like with like almost like one team. But I mean, like it just in the grand scheme of things, like it's common knowledge, if you will, now for like a player to kind of go from point A to point B from a team perspective at that, to go from one team to another. And if you're offering $1 billion, like that's the other part of this. Like, and if you go and you transfer from like one sport to the other, it's like you can offer a quarterback 1 year, $50 million, for him to be a starter week 1, and he probably will take that. And like that's the other thing is like it's definitely $1 billion. I'm not saying that, but like we're talking 1 year, still 1 year for that 1 billion. So like obviously you may be set for that 1 year, 50 million, but you're definitely set for the 1 year, $1 billion. So it's
it's you talk about $50 million contract, that's life-changing money. 776 million straight to his pocket.
Yeah.
That's just a different level.
Yeah.
You're setting up the whole family tree for generations upon generations at that point in time. So it'll be interesting to see what Mbappe decides to do. But by all accounts, the offer's sitting on the table. PSG is more than willing to take it because they could get nothing for him if he walks at the end of the season. So does Mbappe want to take it? Been a lot of turmoil at PSG. They tried to build a super team, bringing Neymar, Messi, Mbappe, and a few other guys over, and it just didn't work. They did not win at the level they expected to. So he's been openly pro Messi, and against his home country in France and the fans and PSG as an organization with the way they treated Messi while he was there. He's dissatisfied with the organization as a whole right now. So I would be amazed if he doesn't take it. But again, it does mean you're going and playing in Saudi. So is that a lifestyle you want? Is that an area you want to live in for a year? Might not be that bad. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Moving over to another ginormous deal that got done this morning and became the largest deal in NBA history. Jaylen Brown of the Celtics got signed for 5 years, $305 million. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there saying, what a ridiculous deal. Why would you sign him to that? This guy is not worth that. I know I'm probably going to be on an island, and we all know I like to live out there by myself on a lot of things anyway, so it's nothing new. But there's not a big difference, in my personal opinion, from what I've seen over the years between Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They are the same guy. They just choose to highlight Jason Tatum a little more than they do Jason Brown, which makes people believe Tatum's the better player. But from my eyes, they're basically the exact same guy. So the way the market and the NBA and the TV contracts and everything else is going, 305 in 5 years is not that wild of a contract in the grand scheme of things if the market keeps going the way it is, like Cam's speaking about a little bit earlier. What does the market bear and what does the market look like in a couple of years? That's not slowing down. So this could look like a really great deal for Boston here in a couple of years, especially when the new CBA kicks in and you get that second tier luxury tax that nobody wants to touch. But it's going to be interesting to see how Boston fills out that roster the next couple of years around Tatum, Brown, and their contracts.
Especially Tatum. What was the max contract to like the max contract you can give out for a player? Like for instance, when the Nuggets gave it out to Michael Porter Jr., what was the max? Wasn't it like 210, 212?
205. 207, depending on years played. And then Jokic last year signed his 5-year 271. I think it's 271. So Jokic was the highest paid player in the NBA last year. Now Brown is going to be the highest paid player this new year. But, you know, Jokic's contract is going to look really good in a couple of years if the market keeps going the way it is. And you got him signed for 5 years.
Right. And then not to mention Jamal Murray having his conversation either, you know, right now or, you know, during the regular season when that's going to come around. So it's just, and so if you're Jamal Murray, not saying you're going to take the 300, right? But like, if you're looking at someone from Jaylen Brown's perspective, you're looking at it like, how can I capitalize on this new market?
Yeah, and the NBA is a little weird. Well, not weird. It's just the way they have it set up. Your max is dependent on years of service. So Brown's got a little bit more years of service than Murray does. So while Murray could still sign the 5-year supermax for him, it's not going to be a 305 deal.
Right.
Which, you know, that's in the Nuggets' favor. And the Nuggets home teams can always pay their players more than if you go somewhere else in free agency and try to sign a supermax. So the Nuggets will be able to offer Murray the most. And I don't see him going anywhere, so I'm not worried about it. But it will be interesting to see if that deal gets done before the season, during the season, or if they wait until he's ready to go in the offseason next year. So,
but it is crazy because if you look at both sports between, and granted, we talked about soccer earlier, but if you look at both sports between Major League Baseball and the NBA, those are the two sports entities where you do see much larger ballooned contracts now.
Absolutely.
I mean, especially when we talked about Shohei Ohtani a couple weeks ago, you know, like potentially him getting maybe even a $500 million deal, if not more. I mean, like, obviously people like that are few and far between. They're rare. And so when you get something like that, you want to make sure to capitalize and, you know, try and sign them. And if you're the Angels, it's pretty unfortunate that you're not going to be able to do that, especially with it being California. But I mean,
sorry,
like,
Cody.
Right. But I think that when you look at it, though, from just both sports, it's crazy how both of those things balloon. Because, I mean, look at, like, the contracts that get handed out from, like, again, I think the way they paid Bruce Brown is the way that you pay Bruce Brown for obviously a deserved contract. But if you look at it from like with where he was with the Denver Nuggets,
oh yeah,
it's like a $20 million plus deal for a guy who was, you know, a flex starter to a sixth man almost, like, you know, on a given night. So you're giving him a $20 million plus deal for something, you know, maybe giving him into the starting lineup a little bit, right? For something like that,
absolutely.
Obviously. Right. But it's just like, still, it's crazy to think about, like, some of these people getting in between like a $15 million deal as a sixth man. And I think that goes to show you how insane some of those contracts are being handed out in the NBA. It's like, and how they value certain players. right? So like they value potentially a sixth man just about as equal to a starter by handing him out that kind of money for a sixth man. You know,
absolutely. And the thing about basketball that I've always appreciated compared to football minus quarterbacks for the most part and baseball as a whole, basketball is usually paying guys their true value in their primes. And they're usually getting the big contracts in their prime. So you're not paying somebody for what they've done. You're not paying somebody for what you think they're going to do. You're paying somebody for what they're doing, for the most part with basketball. And that's kind of the beauty of those contracts. There's not a whole lot of bad contracts in basketball because of that. Whereas baseball, dudes are usually collecting those giant contracts on the back half of their prime, going into their fading years. So those contracts usually become albatrosses on the roster. And then with football, a lot of times guys are looking to get that really nice second contract, but that really nice second contract is usually right in the middle to end of their prime a lot of the times. So by the time it's over, they don't have a chance to collect again. Basketball, you're usually getting 2 of those supermax deals if you're really talented, because you're getting paid at the very beginning of your prime and then again in the middle of your prime, which is unique to basketball. And some of that has to do with roster size. You know, when you're talking 14, 15 guys that you have to pay, compared to baseball, which is like 24, 25. And then football, you're talking about a 53-man roster plus practice squad spending and everything else. That's obviously going to have an effect on, you know, the available funds and what guys can get paid. So it's something that, you know, you got to keep in mind when you're talking about what each sport is willing to pay an individual. But basketball, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's some bad contracts in basketball. There have been. Some guys get paid when they shouldn't have based on one good year. Bruce Brown hopefully will not be an example of that. He's had some pretty steady numbers for the last 3 or 4 years. But and it's not they got to spend the money too. That's the other kicker about basketball is some teams there's that floor you got to hit, and some teams have so much money they got to give it to somebody, and the top guys aren't willing to come, so you got to spend it on somebody, and that's where the bad contracts usually come in.
And it's not something to be like against somebody and say like they don't deserve the contract. It's just the extra layer of it. Like for instance, like Bruce Brown deserved that raise, right? Like to kind of circle back.
Definitely.
Like, Bruce Brown deserved the raise. The question is just, did he deserve that? That's the question. Like that's the question. It isn't so much about like the, you know, like, I mean, what is it? Like, for instance, well, I guess it's almost like the Giancarlo Stanton or the Mike Stanton like contracts. Like it's just like he deserved a big payday, and actually, I'll get to another point I was going to mention earlier, but it's just like, but I think when you look at contracts, it's like, did they deserve that kind of contract in the early part of their career, and then they start tailing off? Because I think the one thing that baseball is now starting to do, which is somewhat similar to basketball, is you are starting to see a lot more teams pay the young up and coming stars early in their careers and making sure that they lock them up. The question is just, you know, avoiding the arbitration years and stuff like that. That's the conversation for another day. It's just like, but the moment, you know, you're able to do that is like, it's the question. I mean, like, for instance, there's Ellie De La Cruz, right, for the Reds, right? I'm sure that the Reds will be entertaining a conversation about locking him up to a pretty lengthy contract extension at some point after this year or next year, or even right now. But it's just like, that's the question. It's just like, what is the determined length of time for that? So I do like the fact that basketball has kind of influenced somewhat of some decisions in other sports like that. And actually, I would say if there's one team in particular who's really been at the brunt of this in terms of baseball, it's the Braves. The Braves kind of started this trend with was a couple years ago where they locked up Acuna, they locked up Albies, and then they recently, within the last year or so, locked up Austin Riley.
Yes.
So it's just like you're starting to see, I think, this trend where if you have the money to spend, I'm looking at you, Rockies. If you have the money to spend, do it. Like, and like, don't like pussyfoot around and, you know, and don't act like you don't have money when we all know you have money. You just choose not to spend it. Like, make sure that you are spending the type of money on players to ensure that they come here, or to ensure that they can be able to staying long term, and you can have that long term success. So it's
That's
just
a great point. I mean, I think what baseball is kind of learning is similar to what basketball has done, like you said, kind of influencing other sports, is the idea that don't wait until the guy's done with his rookie deal or his second level mid-tier deal and then have to force to sign him to the giant contract that's above market value. Pay him a giant contract early that's commensurate with what they're doing, but it's not the biggest contract in the league, which gives you time to see if they're truly going to develop, if they're going to keep on that trajectory. And if they do, then you can bump them up again. But, you know, that incremental growth of paying a big contract and not a giant contract is something that you're absolutely right. Baseball is definitely doing. I think you're right with the Braves. They're kind of on the forefront of that thought process.
Yeah. And then, then you go look, and I guess we can move forward with the other one, which happened, within the last 2 hours, which was the big contract of the day. And that was Justin Herbert finally getting his deal. I was going to ask you a question, because we had this conversation on the 5280 podcast. And for anybody that is in the chat too, I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are. But Justin Herbert signs his deal, and obviously there's no question he deserves that deal. Sure. He's been very productive when it comes to the Chargers. The question is just, here comes my question. Who is under the most pressure for the Chargers? Is it, Brandon Staley's a given pressure, by the way, on this question. But, like, who is under more pressure? Is it Kellen Moore or is it Justin Herbert? Because Kellen Moore should have been a head coach within the last two head coaching cycles. Justin Herbert has been a very productive quarterback in the NFL, almost like starting the career out like Peyton Manning. A very productive quarterback, but he had a 27-0 lead in the playoffs against the Jacksonville Jaguars to a quarterback who's looking at that deal that Justin Herbert just signed and potentially looking at that and maybe saying, okay, I could potentially weasel my way out of this and get a better deal because I beat Herbert out of that and actually won something in a game that Jacksonville's not done in quite some time. That's a side story. But is Justin Herbert under more pressure, or is Kellen Moore under the most pressure?
So I'm going to throw a curveball at you, and then I'll kind of also answer the proposition that you put out there. I would actually say there's a third option, and it's the front office. And this is why. So let me breathe just a little bit here. I recently saw a stat that Justin Herbert has scored more points with an offense as a quarterback his first 4 years in the league than any quarterback in the history of the NFL. The defense that he has on the other side of the football for the Chargers has also allowed the most points in the first 4 years of a quarterback's career. So to me, personally, Herbert isn't under any pressure other than to just keep playing the way he's been playing. The pressure truly lies, in my opinion, in the front office to put a average, just an average defense on the field that can allow your quarterback to show that what he's been doing is really, really good and shouldn't have to be suffering these losses and taking the critic and the heat that he has been with not being able to win those big games. So I would say the front office, more so than anybody, needs to get their stuff together and figure out that defensive side of the ball, because you've now locked up Herbert, and he's a proven entity. Now, if I have to pick between Herbert and Kellen Moore, I would say with everything that's happened with Kellen Moore in the last year, Dak kind of seeing a down year last year, McCarthy coming out and saying, I don't want to score a bunch of points, I want to win games, which is, we're not even going to go down how foolish that statement is. And then, like you said, many thought he was going to be a head coach in the last couple cycles and hasn't. Switching teams from Dallas, where he was homegrown, drafted as the quarterback, moved up through the ranks, became their offensive coordinator. He was Jerry's guy, everybody believed, and then Jerry allowed him to leave. I think there's more questions around Kellen Moore and what he's going to be able to do kind of out on his own now, and running that offense for Staley and the Chargers with Justin Herbert. That's where I believe the more pressure lies.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think the one thing that is a lot of pressure on Justin Herbert, because, let's not make any bones about it, though. Like, there's still a lot of pressure on Herbert. I just think that when you obviously, this is the given pressure as well, but like when you sign that big massive deal, you're expected to perform, and you're expected to perform in advance. And it's one of the reasons why I'd be kind of curious about like what's going to happen. And that's why if you're looking at the trio of people that are under a lot of pressure, Brandon Staley is one of them, and Brandon Staley may end up being the fall guy out of all of it, or it could be Brandon Staley and Kellen Moore, depending on how it happens. But like Brandon, I think it's one of the reasons, and not to dive too much into the Broncos here, but it's one of the reasons why I felt like the fact the Broncos pulled a Deion Sanders, to use this as an example, pulled a Deion Sanders and did the unthinkable and brought in Sean Payton to be the head coach of the Broncos will only help them long term as much as it is right now. And so because of the fact that if the Chargers lost Staley, we all know, we read the rumors, we heard the rumors, the Los Angeles Chargers and or the Los Angeles Rams were a team that Sean Payton was eyeballing. And so
he wants that quarterback. So absolutely.
Yeah. So if the fact that we were able to get something like that and they may lose Brandon Staley puts also the Chargers in a much greater disadvantage, to possibly, make it so that they can bring someone in. Granted, the Chargers are a very attractive spot, but the question is going to become if Kellen Moore is not going to be able to work out, right? If Kellen Moore's not going to be able to work out and they've let go of Brandon Staley, who's to say that the next coach they bring in wants Kellen Moore as their offensive coordinator? Because then you're talking about a situation where Justin Herbert has been productive. He's definitely outshined his coaches for sure with Joe Lombardi, and maybe if it moves on from Kellen Moore, you'll be talking about 3 offensive coordinators, in almost like 4 years, 5 years almost. And so that's just not good for a quarterback's development. I will say though, and this is to circle back and put a final bow on Justin Herbert, he is a great example, and he is a great example of why, one, the draft, as great as it is in terms of draft analysis and diving into a prospect, it is so important that we do not overthink a prospect.
Absolutely.
Justin Herbert was a prime example of that. I mean, there were comparisons being thrown left and right. And in terms of the Paxton Lynch discussion, yes, that Paxton Lynch, the one that would play video games, play Call of Duty, play Madden, instead of studying for a playbook. But the fact that we were able to get Justin Herbert and do what he was able to do, which was rewrite the narrative that he is not Paxton Lynch. He's a guy that's going to be putting in the effort. He's going to be putting in the work and become arguably the most productive quarterback we've seen in a couple year span, more right next to Patrick Mahomes, who's in division. So the fact that we're able to see that tells us that maybe he can actually outshine these guys like a Kellen Moore and outshine these kind of coaching decisions and perform at the highest level. So that's probably the most important point I wanted to get off, was that Justin Herbert, he is rewriting this whole overthinking overthinking part of it for draft analysts.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what blows my mind with Justin Herbert, and this happens with a lot of guys, he come out a year before, he was arguably the number 1 pick. He decided to go back to school for another year in Oregon. Oregon as a team had a down year. They had a new offensive coordinator, a new system, and people saw Herbert have a down year compared to what he was doing, and they took points away from him because of that. Like he had not already done the things that made you want him to be a number 1 pick. So, like you said, you start overthinking that. You start looking at things that your eyes should be telling you are true, and you start convincing yourself they're not because of a record or a poor game. Too many people start thinking that this is a individual sport when it's a team game. And there are so many factors that go into wins and losses. You have to be able to dissect and see and start compartmentalizing why those things are happening. And is the guy still looking good even though he's looking bad, if that makes sense? I think Josh Allen's another perfect example. All the film I saw on Josh Allen coming out of Wyoming, I was in awe. That dude was amazing. But people talked about his accuracy. They talked about his win-loss. They talked about his decision-making. But they didn't want to talk about how the talent he was playing with was subpar. And if you're playing with subpar talent, two things are going to be true. One, you're going to overcompensate to try and make up for it. And two, that talent's not going to be able to do the things they should to make you look good. So you're absolutely right in the idea that you cannot overthink or start second guessing yourself when you have a belief in something as far as a grade or a decision on a specific player.
Yeah, and we'll see if that's something that you see with draft analysts now. By the way, congratulations, Clayton.
Yes.
1 year sober. Congratulations.
Won't even raise my glass to you, my guy.
Yeah, do a salute to you, buddy.
That's awesome. Very cool. Very cool.
And I think also like you'll start to see that with some other quarterbacks. Actually, I would even say there's probably a few quarterbacks now to where you're starting to see somewhat of that example. But at the same time, it's also more so the player at that point than it would be the quarterback than the actual draft analyst and stuff like that. What I'm trying to get at is the other Justin in the room, which is Justin Fields. He played okay like when it came to the Chicago Bears, but he took off last year and really was a productive player and used his legs a lot more than I think people really showed. And I think that people, and we've had this conversation off the mic and behind the scenes, but it's like I think people have a tendency to forget how good of a quarterback he was in college, and that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see players like Justin Fields and C.J.
Outplayed
Stroud.
Trevor Lawrence 2 years in a row on the biggest stage, and that was throwing the ball.
And that's not even over. It's not even over analyzing, say, Trevor Lawrence and saying Trevor Lawrence is a bad quarterback because no, but not by any means. But it goes to show you how difference is starting to get that way for the Ohio State Buckeyes quarterbacks, and how different they're starting to view it, and how you actually can have an accurate quarterback who wants to use his legs and use his legs more versus, say, a prototypical passer. Now, the thing with C.J. Stroud that was different was he was just on point. Like, he was pure pocket passer. To where it was, on the money every single time. And then once the actual moment came where he shined, it was the biggest game, maybe the national championship of the playoffs, which was Georgia, nearly should have won. But the thing with Justin Fields, though, that people have to understand is he is a much better passer than people give him credit for.
Absolutely.
And I think that when it comes to this situation about overanalyzing, it's also to the point of overanalyzing what we're seeing right now in the pros. Because I think that there's also the point where, for instance, if you put Zach Wilson in a much better type situation, say in New England or say San Francisco, if you were to put Zach Wilson in San Francisco, I would imagine you would be seeing a much better version of Zach Wilson than you are with the New York Jets situation.
Well, that's a great point, Cam, because, and this is a conversation Pinky and I have often, and we are on very opposite sides of the fence. Pinky looks at what you're doing on the field and the production, and that's how he judges you. I'm looking at what you're doing on the field and your talent level, regardless of if it's an interception thrown or a bad game. I'm looking at all the other components. How is the coaching? What's the play calling look like? Are they doing any favors to get the quarterback in a rhythm? Things of that nature. To the point where we very rarely agree on what or who is a good quarterback in this league. And a perfect example, you brought up Zach Wilson. Well, his predecessor, who the Jets dumped to go grab Zach Wilson, Sam Darnold, was put in atrocious situation for years. And I still believe he may not get his chance because San Francisco's kind of already said some other people are their guys. They put draft capital into one of them. The other one started and took them to the playoffs. I believe Sam Darnold is by far the most talented quarterback on that San Francisco roster. If if they have a true quarterback competition, I believe Sam Darnold will come out as the starter by the start of the season. He's finally in a situation where he has somebody who's going to protect him. He has a head coach that knows how to play call, and he has weapons around him. Now, if he turned around and failed after all of that, then I would have to eat my crow and say I was wrong. But he's never been given a true opportunity to play in a good system with good players around him, and people downgrade him because of that rather than the situations that he's been in. So I agree. The NFL is notorious for it. There's an old guard in the NFL that's still prevalent. It's changing, but it's still prevalent, where they have this idea that you're going to come into the NFL and you're going to play our system. And if you can't play our system and you look bad, that's your fault, not our fault for not using your talents properly. And this new guard is saying, wait. You're really good at this stuff? Why don't we just build the offense around that and make everybody look good? So there's this battle going on right now in the NFL between that old guard thought and this new guard thought of maximizing the talent versus making the talent maximize in your direction.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things too is it goes to show you the marriage that you have to have, and you touched on a little bit, but the marriage that you have to have with your offensive coordinator and the quarterback. And so I don't necessarily know in terms of what will, and this is where you and I kind of have a tendency to disagree a little bit. And that's like the Nathaniel Hackett, Aaron Rodgers stuff. And that's just based on what we saw, with Denver, but that's also a head coaching stuff. And so it's different to where you're batting 500 versus, Adam Gase, where he never had the chance to coach Peyton Manning again. Right. But you almost have an Adam Gase situation where he failed miserably and over his head. But then he actually was batting 500 and actually had that opportunity to be with Aaron Rodgers one more time. But I think it's important, though, to bring up that OC and quarterback relationship, because one other really good friend of Nathaniel Hackett and Aaron Rodgers happens to be the offensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears, Lou Getsy. And as you saw throughout the year, they were starting to work more with Fields, and you started to see more of the chemistry with just him and some of the players and scheming up, the players that you were seeing. And so now that they are able to have a Chase Claypool, who I'm not exactly all that high on, but he's a solid number 2, or you have a DJ Moore now in that room. I'm curious to see what's going to happen with that Chicago Bears offense now. And then, of course, you have a Darnell Mooney is a sneaky little option down there. But
I think Cole Kmet's underrated as well. I think they've got the right pieces now to do some damage. And now it's up to Fields and the offensive coordinator, like you're talking about, to use those weapons to their advantage. I think you brought up an interesting point with Nathaniel Hackett, and this is the last thing I'll say about that. Sometimes the best coach is a coach who knows that the player he's coaching is smarter in the sense that they know what they're really good at and they're not really good at, and allowing that player to do that rather than sitting here trying to prove how smart you are as an OC. And Nathaniel Hackett is a great example of that. It's pretty well known that Rodgers, just like Peyton Manning, kind of runs the offense, calls his plays, sets up the schemes the way he wants to. And Nathaniel Hackett kind of is that sounding board, if you will, that allows Rodgers to discuss it, work it out, think it through, talk it out, and then help call those plays, or send a couple plays in and allow Rodgers to decide how he's going to work through those plays based on what he's seeing on the field. Sometimes those are the best coaches, but they don't get credit for that line of thinking because they may not necessarily be the ones calling the plays per se. Hackett wasn't ready to be the head coach. The only reason I was ever excited about him becoming the head coach in Denver is because I thought it meant Aaron Rodgers was coming. Once Aaron Rodgers was not that option, they went Russell Wilson, I was immediately, and I made it very clear to a lot of people, I was not happy about the hire. Now, I still think Hackett was used as a scapegoat to an extent because I don't think Peyton is a great GM. I think he's kind of gotten lucky a couple times, and it's allowed him some extended rope, which I don't think Sean Payton is going to give him, and I don't think the new ownership is very keen on either. So I don't see Patton sticking around a whole lot longer, to be perfectly honest with you, unless he becomes, a puppet in the sense that Sean Payton runs everything, and Patton just has the name and title, but not the actual decision-making capabilities. So I feel like there's a lot going into it. I am a big Fields guy. I've not made any qualms about that. I've been very open about it, and I have felt that they have not done him any justice. Now they've done him justice. I'm big on DJ Moore. I do think Cole Kmet's good. Darnell Mooney was talking about as a breakout candidate a couple years ago, and the play calling, the offensive line, and some other issues caused that to not go down. So there are guys now out there. You know, Lamar Jackson won't have any more excuses after this year by all accounts. Mm-hmm. Justin Fields won't have any more excuses after this year by all accounts. If Sam Darnold were to start for San Francisco, he would not have any more excuses. So I think there's a lot of guys this season in particular that I'm really excited to see what happens, because they're either going to prove a lot of people wrong or they're going to prove a lot of people right.
And circling back on the contract discussion and, of course, the OC head coach relationship with the quarterback, you start looking at the fact that Joe Burrow and, of course, the quarterback that defeated Justin Herbert is, you know, going to be up for a contract, you know, at some point. And so guys like Trevor Lawrence, who, I mean, let's face it, you're talking about a head coach who there was a little bit of some turmoil in Philadelphia, and I'm not here to point fingers at who's to blame and whatever, but we all know about where Doug Peterson was and is as the head coach and or even a play caller. But you put him with Trevor Lawrence, that goes back to that discussion about how important it is schematically to put your players in the right place at the right time. And as much crap that Urban Meyer got, and rightfully so, being the worst head coach arguably in the NFL, one of the smart things that he ever did as a coach was bringing on Travis Etienne. Because if one of the important things that you can have as a transition to the National Football League is players who are comfortable enough with you already at that next level. Point. And so the fact that they were able to bring on Travis Etienne, and you are starting to see the Travis Etienne that we saw in college, which was a really special player.
I had him above Najee Harris. Yeah, me personally, coming out of that draft.
Yeah, and so when you look at it from what they were able to do and build within Jacksonville, Doug Peterson is truly sitting pretty. And to think about like how he was not the first candidate for the job, it was Byron Leftwich, and Leftwich was a little uncertain about the job, and so the fact that they limped, to use that phraseology, they limped into Doug Peterson goes to show you that if you hit the head coach right, you could see to use a college analogy, you could see a Tennessee Volunteers type leap as a franchise. I mean, sure. And so, I mean, it's certainly possible of what we'll see with the Jacksonville Jaguars next year, but they're definitely one of those cases of what are they going to be like in that second year, now that they had the greatest comeback in team history against the Los Angeles Chargers. And you saw with what you did with Trevor Lawrence truly being that guy, turning that team around, if you will, and turn that game around after playing as bad as he did. So,
let's be honest. Something that is very common with Jacksonville did, what Philadelphia did with Jalen Hurts. What was the other example I always talked about? But they invested in their quarterback. And by that, I mean, they said, okay, we believe we have a really good quarterback. What does a quarterback need to be successful? You got to protect him and you got to give him weapons. And they said, we're going to go all in and we're going to go get you weapons and we're going to go get you protection. And both teams did that. I believe Baltimore has finally done that now with the OC hire and finally looking at the wide receiver room, although I think they missed a little bit on the wide receiver room. Time will tell. But they still went and got him some extra weapons. He already had some protection. That's what Chicago went and did this offseason for Justin Fields. you can't sit here and go back to Sam Darnold and the Jets and say, well, we made a mistake with Sam Darnold. No. The mistake you made was not putting weapons of protection around him. That's the mistake you made. The mistake wasn't drafting that quarterback because you never got to see what that quarterback was truly capable of. And so what I'm hoping is this new trend, I'm hoping it becomes a trend, is teams saying, all right, we drafted somebody who we think is really talented, but to be successful in the NFL, you need these specific categories filled. And if you don't have these specific categories filled, the likelihood of seeing that success is very slim.
And that's called incentives. For anybody that doesn't know, that's kind of like incentives. And so then looking at the guys that are part of the contract discussion in terms of Joe Burrow, you're looking at Justin Herbert and with what he was able to get as a contract. I would imagine I can't see him. Obviously, he could get $300 million, but the thing is I could see him because it's almost like the Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts type of stuff where it was roughly the exact same deal, but it was different by like $5 million or something like that. But the thing that's slightly different in Joe Burrow's case, because what was it? It was 262 or something like that for Herbert. It was 262. I could see Burrow somewhere in the camp of 270, 265 maybe, or even 270 to 275 with obviously slightly more guarantees. But at the same time, it's like we're talking about an argument where if you're comparing Joe Burrow's career right now with Justin Herbert's career, I'll be honest, Burrow's career is better than Justin Herbert's. Herbert's is definitely a very, very productive, and he's a great quarterback. But the fact that Burrow has been able to lead his teams to multiple AFC championships and a Super Bowl, which they could have won. They actually could have won that Super Bowl. So if they
shout out to a Nebraska guy, Zach Taylor. Shout out.
That's right. Cam Taylor, Brett, Stanley Morgan. Yeah. So, but I think that the fact they were able to really, make sure that they were able to build around him. And oh, by the way, to go off of the exact same conversation we just had with Trevor Lawrence, again, Penei Sewell probably was the right pick positionally. But if you are here to make the chemistry between your quarterback and your wide receiver like the same as it has been in
I said that was a terrible pick at the time. I will eat that crow because they proved me wrong on many levels.
But you put Jamar Chase now with Joe Burrow again, with Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins and and that wide receiving room and a tight end room, which is a little bit in flux, but that's okay. An offensive line that's getting better. But Joe Burrow has clearly shown that he can play above the deficiencies of that team, the offensive line, and play at a high level and get that team to where they need to be. So for Macaulay Culkin to really, do what he did, on the football field is something incredible.
Well, you bring up an interesting point too, that I'm very interested to see how this Joe Burrow, more so than any other contract. And the main reason for that is Cincy is known, their ownership is known for we're not spending money. We will do everything we can to be somewhat competitive for some years, but we're not spending money to keep that product on the field. They just don't. They don't ante up. They are now in a position where, hey, if we ante up, we could be looking at dynasty alongside Kansas City, which is becoming a rivalry in its own right because of the games they've had in the bigger moments. And we're going to talk about rivalries in a second, but since he finally say, yeah, we've got our guy, we're going to pay you the big money, let's set this contract up in such a way. And does Joe Burrow want to set the contract up in such a way similar to a Patrick Mahomes, where it feels like and sounds like a really big number on the front of it, but then when you really start looking at the contract, it's actually very team friendly and allows a lot of flexibility to continue to put pieces around you if they're willing to spend the money to do so. Does Cincy kind of change their history in that regard and move forward with, all right, we're going to start putting that money up to do the things that we need to be truly successful.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen. And this is like the last little crop of quarterbacks now with Trevor Lawrence and, Burrow, with some of those other quarterbacks kind of waiting in the wings. And so, yeah, it'll be kind of curious to see what's going to happen.
Well, yeah, because you'll have Burrow go next, then probably Trevor Lawrence. If Fields plays really well this year, he could be in that mix as well. Pinky said it before. I've talked about it a lot. This is one of the few things we seem to be on the same page about. Is we are in a golden age of quarterbacks in the NFL right now, and I have said I truly believe it's because of that changing of the guard that I talked about earlier, where we're no longer trying to do square peg round hole. We've got guys in positions of power and decision making saying, these are your talents, these are your skill levels, this is what you do really well, this is what you do really bad. Let's build around the strengths and minimize the deficiencies rather than trying to make you do something you aren't good at. And that, because of, is why I believe we're seeing such a high level of success for quarterbacks coming into the league these days.
Yeah. And I think that's why, and I to circle back to the Broncos discussion, since this is still somewhat of a Broncos podcast. It's a sports podcast, but this is somewhat of a Broncos podcast to a certain extent. It's so important, though, why the Broncos had to do what they had to do, to use that Deion Sanders comparison again. They had to do what they had to do, to bring Peyton in and make him the head coach, because long term, he is the best coach for right now to potentially fix Russell Wilson. And come 2024, now that you've recouped your draft picks and everything, that is a draft class that if you want to find your guy to and this is to bring into our conversation, there is some really good quarterbacks coming out. I mean, and this isn't the case.
There could be 6 or 7 dudes that are first round capability.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking a lot of players. And now, granted, we're talking right now before, obviously, the college football season starts, the Senior Bowl, bowl games, the interviews at the Combine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where this is before that, obviously. I get that. But guys like Drake May, obviously Caleb Williams, he's going number 1 overall. We're ignoring that. But Drake May, Shedeur Sanders, Michael Penix Jr., there's a quarterback who has helped his stock more since leaving Indiana, it's been Michael Penix Jr. Because Caleb DeBoer, if anybody's not been paying attention, has been arguably the most successful college football coach the last couple seasons. Bo Nix.
Well, you got a guy like Joe Milton now out in Tennessee, who the guy leaving Tennessee this year is talking about how he's going to make him look not as good. In Hendon Hooker. Hendon Hooker can't talk highly enough about Milton. And he's another example of a guy who left a program, maybe not the right situation for him. Now he's going to play with Heupel, who you talked about earlier as a guy who made a big turnaround and put that program back on the map. There are things. So, another name to keep an eye on this year, that Quinn Ewers down in Texas. There are so many names that could be first-round grades in next year's draft that you're absolutely right. I don't think Sean Payton is a big fan of Russ Wilson. That's my own personal reading between the lines of everything that's happened so far.
We're not going to get into that, but the fact it's about the future, though. And so it's just like, and so like, it's just more about the future and the fact that that's why they're set up so much, why the Payton hire was such a big deal, because it's like, if they move on from Russ, it's so important that they still be able to think and ponder about swinging for the fences and getting that type of guy. Because then the moment you get that guy, you're entering the type of situation that was Alex Smith and Pat Mahomes, and look how that turned out.
Absolutely. Totally agree. So obviously there's some big contracts. There's some interesting contracts coming up. We talked about the running back market last week in contracts. So how these next couple of years unfold and who gets paid, and then how those teams are built around them, specifically in the NFL with these contracts, is going to be a lot of fun to watch. A lot of fun.
And the other question that you almost would have to say contract-wise, since we're talking rookies, are the rookie contracts going to balloon again?
Well, so I was going to kind of lead into that here, Cam, with rivalries. Now, normally people are going to think about rivalries as team versus team, player versus player, things of that nature. I'm going to start rivalries off in a slightly different manner, and it's going to allow us to still kind of continue this conversation on salaries as well. The rivalry between owner team versus player. We kind of touched on it a little bit last week. And I've said, I'm usually in the player's side when it comes to contracts and getting paid. If you're one of those elite guys, you've earned it, you deserve it. When it comes to contracts specifically, and we can kind of focus on the NFL for this conversation, the idea of the franchise tag, the idea of first-round guys, team being able to exercise that fifth-year option. Now, granted, these are things that were collectively bargained. So players had an option to not go down these roads if they wanted to, and they agreed to them. So now they're locked into these situations, and they're trying to talk about how these situations are unfair. I agree they're unfair to an extent, but you had an opportunity to do something different, and you chose not to. You chose to fight other battles for whatever reason and accept these things. I personally hate the fifth-year option. I also personally hate the franchise tag. The reason I hate the fifth-year option is because I don't like the team having that much control of a player's future in a sport that has so much variables when it comes to injury. I believe if you want to pay them, instead of doing that fifth-year option, you should be exercising a contract extension. The reason I hate the franchise tag is because I personally believe it's an unfair way of paying a player in the sense that the player has no control over whether or not they want to accept it. Now, if the franchise tag was just a one-time deal and a team could use it once, I'd be cool with it. But the fact that you can use it multiple years to then extend a player's prime out and not be able to capitalize on market value of a long-term contract, that's where I side on the player's side of it rather than the owner's side. Now, this is where I kind of get myself twisted and I talk out of both sides of my mouth. From a team perspective, a business perspective, they're incredibly smart moves and incredibly smart tools to use. And from a team perspective, they're great building block tools that you should absolutely take advantage of. So I see both sides of it, but I do err a little bit more on the side of the players in the sense that the teams have slightly too much control in those regards.
Yeah, I kind of understand it from the side of like the franchise tag, the player option. It offers you flexibility. So to what you were saying, in terms of with the fifth year option, the one thing the fifth year option at least allows, it does allow the ownership to wisely decide whether or not to place that fifth year option on the player, or decide to not put the fifth year option on the player. Right. I mean, look at it from the Broncos perspective. They decided not to put the fifth year option on Garrett Bowles. He goes out and balls out for that year and deservedly got that contract extension. The other part that it offers you flexibility is that you can put the fifth year option on the player. And the moment that fifth year option is on the player, you can decide whether or not to scrap that fifth year option, or you can decide to use that fifth year option to not front load your deal, and to back load your deal, in turn. And so basically you can still use that as part of your deal. So in essence, you're signing him to a 4-year deal, but we all know it's a 5-year deal because of the fact that has the fifth year option into that. So I think it offers you a lot of flexibility, for both the player and the ownership from that fifth year option standpoint. The franchise tag gets a little bit tricky because that's when you're a little unsure. Like, for instance, when you're the Broncos case this last year or this last off season, where you really don't exactly have a player that you should franchise tag, really, in this off season. I mean, you can make the case that they probably should have franchise tagged Draymond Jones. But when they re-signed, or when they went out and signed Zach Allen, it was pretty evident that they were replacing Zach Allen with Draymond Jones. But I mean, like, when you look at it from the franchise perspective, it's just like I think the franchise tag is also a misnomer, because I think at times people that's not an NFL fan will look at the franchise tag off the naked eye and just say, "Oh, this is a franchise player." Doesn't mean that, actually.
Absolutely.
And because I mean, like, Tony Pollard got the franchise tag, but we all know Tony Pollard's not their franchise player. This is where we kind of tend to disagree a little bit with Tony Pollard, but it's like we know Tony Pollard is not the franchise player down there. We know it's, either a CD Lamb or maybe even a Dak Prescott, if so be it, or whatever. But like we know that like those players are more deserving of the franchise tag. But this is when it gets a little bit hazy, because like the 5th-year option, you place it on the guy because it gives you the security and the option of keeping that player for that 1 year. And then not only that, but it also keeps you the security to also lock him up long term. Like the Broncos were trying to do that with Justin Simmons this last couple off seasons, and they were really fortunate enough to do that. Granted, I think Justin wanted to stay here. He's wanted to stay in Denver, for his entire career, and so far he's done that. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, it does offer you that security in terms of agent and team to work something out long term for a contract extension. So it definitely has its gray areas, and I would say there's far more gray areas with the franchise tag than there is the 5th-year option.
Definitely.
Because of the fact that, one, you rarely see a franchise tag happen for a guard, or you rarely see a franchise tag happen for an offensive lineman, interior offensive lineman, might I add. You see it for a tackle, but you don't see it for a center, really. You don't see it for a guard. You really don't see it for those. You don't even see it really for a kicker, for that matter, because like kicker and sometimes like running back, not to throw that position under the bus, but just that's an easy position to replace. It's an easy position to replace. And so
it's true.
But again, it's the gray area of like, what do we want to spend that, what is it? 10.1 for the running back, 17 million for wide receiver, whatever it is now. The 23, the 23, 24, 25, or, however many it is, for the, for the quarterback. Now there's just ways to pick and choose what it is that your franchise tag is worth. And I think to use this as an example, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but we use Dak Prescott as an example. They basically franchise tagged him twice, right? Or that was like the attempt was that they were going to try and franchise tag him twice. And that is all fun and well and good, right? But if you don't lock him up to a contract extension, it is meaningless. It is actually meaningless if you don't sign him to that, because we all know the franchise tag, if it is like the 35 million, is, I use it as a joke, is backup money now than it is,
right.
The 50 million, what you're seeing now. And I use that as a joke because obviously Daniel Jones signed for the 41 or 40.
Yeah.
So I use that as a joke, but yeah.
The franchise tag, the 5th-year option, they're chess pieces. And I'm all about playing that board and looking at your pieces and moving them in the way that's going to give you the best opportunity to have long-term success. So I understand the chess piece part of it.
Yeah.
The other thing I will add to this, and throw a wrench in, if you will, is one of the reasons I hate these two things specifically when it comes to contracts, and I'll analogy it to basketball a little bit, with the one and done scenario with college players. It's a way that the league has set up protection for the owners for making stupid decisions. It's protecting them from themselves, basically, rather than forcing them to go out there and make a decision and live with it, whether it's good or bad. You're building in this buffer, this pillow, if you will, to fall on, so that, in Saquon Barkley's case, as an example, yes, he signed the 1-year deal for $11 million, so he's getting a little bit more than the franchise tag. But basically, he signed his franchise tag. In all intents and purposes, he signed his franchise tag. If he goes out and gets injured again, then the franchise tag kind of saved you from signing him to a long-term deal at a 15, 16 million a year, for the next 5 years. I don't like personally that protection. Just like I hate the one and done in the NBA. The one and done was specifically made because 3 or 4 years in a row, there were a couple owners who drafted high school players that failed epically. And instead of doing their due diligence and truly looking at the talent and the potential of growth there and what that maturity level was to have that level of growing, they drafted solely off of the talent that they saw on their faces and that awe factor, if you will. And I feel like that happens a lot less in the NFL because these protections have been in place so that the owners don't have to be forced to make those difficult decisions.
Well, and even then you see some of the one and dones now. But it's also one of the reasons why the high school stuff is, obsolete anymore because of that. And you also know that the high school talent, while they're very few and far between, there's at least like one player that that's like, okay, this guy could be a stud and may end up being a one and done. Zion Williamson being one of those cases, Bronny James potentially being one of those guys. And by the way, thoughts and prayers go out to Bronny James.
I was going to talk about that, so absolutely.
With his situation and scary situation with the cardiac arrest. But yeah, thoughts and prayers go out to the James family. But I mean, he may be one of those guys.
Shout out for football. DeMar Hamlin came out and said, "I'm there for anything you guys need," because the James family was big in his corner with helping him get back. So kind of a tie-in there for sure.
Yeah. But he may be one of those guys. And I know that LeBron has mentioned a few times that maybe he wants to play with his son for a year or two, or something along those lines. So I think
Henderson, LaMelo Ball, another couple names where they probably
Carmelo Anthony. Carmelo Anthony went to
definitely
when it was not high school, but I mean, I think that's where the gray area of the 1 year, the one and done thing was just like. And I'm also a big thing on education too, though. So when you talk about the one and done rule, it's like if you go to college, at least be there for 3 years before you kind of make your decision. And I get it from a financial perspective of making sure that you meet ends meet with family and so on and so forth. I get that perspective of it. I definitely get that perspective for sure. And I think it's probably one of the biggest deters of why the one and done rule is a big deal. I just love the idea for maturity's sake when you're there for 3 years and you spent X amount of years at a university, growing that university, leading that university, potentially being the guy at the university. I mean, it's
I like what baseball does. If you go to college, you're there for 3 years. Football is similar. To me personally, that's the way it should be set up for every league. There's been some guys in NFL history that by all accounts were ready to play in the league coming out of high school. They were already grown men. But they never had the opportunity to show that. Now, that's for very different reasons. That's more of a safety issue with football and really trying to make sure your body is fully developed and things of that nature before you come into the league. But like basketball, I fully believe it should be you can come straight out of college or high school if you want to, or if you go to college, you got a 3-year commitment minimum. Now the gray area then becomes, if you go play in the G League or overseas or something like that, how many years do you have to stay there before you're allowed to come to the league? I think a one and done in that situation is fine.
You're in the developmental league at that point.
Exactly. And you're playing professionally at that point. Yeah. So it's not a bounce around and a step up kind of thing. But again, we're talking about the league specifically negotiating and setting up moves that protect the owners from their own bad decisions. And I think that's the major reason why I would err on the side of being against these things. Because to me, I would rather see the smart businessmen who know how to put the right people in positions of decision making and can evaluate true talent. I would rather see them be rewarded rather than having to fall back on a pillow, if you will. Now, I say that, and at the same time, those smart people though are still using these chess moves to their advantage.
Yeah.
Now I don't think the Giants did their thing very well. I think they should have franchise tagged Daniel Jones, and they should have worked a deal out with Saquon.
Right.
But again, time's going to tell if that was the correct move or not.
So are you trying to say that, I'm not saying it's the greatest rivalry of all time, but I mean, are you trying to say, and in terms of just full on clarity, like that a owner and player is maybe the greatest rivalry then of all time, or at least like one of that?
I don't know if I'd say it's the greatest per se. I would say it's the most consistent. And I think it gets overlooked a lot. And I think we have throughout sports history, it's been developed and almost ingrained into fans that you have to stick with your team and not be able to root for the player. Now, I think that's changing a little bit over the years, especially with fantasy football being so prevalent. Fans are not as devoted, I guess might be the word, to the team, and then therefore being completely against the player if they leave or make a better decision for themselves. But I do feel that rivalry is one that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of the back and forth that you constantly see. And I think people don't necessarily think about it as a rivalry.
That's fair. And because I will be completely honest, when I see, and this is the whole point of, not to say you did clickbait, but I'm just saying this is the whole point of clickbait, is when you read something, you typically think greatest rivalries of all time. Okay. And we'll talk about it obviously, but it's like, you're thinking of like the Green Bays, versus the Bears, or the Nebraska versus Oklahoma, Nebraska versus Colorado, like, or Michigan versus Ohio State. Like, you're thinking of like legitimate rivalries, like, team versus team, Magic versus Bird.
Exactly.
Like you're thinking of like, some of those Roger Federer versus Rafael Nadal, Andre Agassi versus
Pete Sampras.
I mean, so like you're thinking of stuff like that, not
exactly,
and those are rivalries, like
absolutely.
But it's just like, you don't necessarily think, when you peel back the onion, you don't necessarily think, oh, it's the ownership and the player rivalry, right? I mean, and I think that now I don't know too much on the backstory, but I mean, that there's probably a fair point for John Elway and the Baltimore Colts. Like, there was a reason why John Elway did not want to go to the Baltimore Colts, and so it's just
the Mannings as a whole versus the Chargers,
right? And yeah, and so I just think that there was just something deeply rooted potentially for an owner and a player. I don't know if it'll get to that point or what will come of it, but it would be interesting for Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. I would be curious about it.
Yes.
Like, because I've made this comparison a little bit before, but like, it seemed like the Packers were treating Rodgers like Nolan Arenado was to the Colorado Rockies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's another one. The Rockies are a great example of ownership and player. So I mean, you don't need to look no further for ownership.
Tulo, Story. I mean, that list goes on there with the Rockies.
Yeah. You can make an entire.
But I wanted to bring a different light, a different perspective, a different thought process of what a rivalry could mean in the sports world, rather than just, like you said, that team, player versus player kind of aspect. It's always something that's been very interesting to me. The dynamic that's there, where people want to talk about loyalty when you may not get loyalty from both sides, whether it's the player or the ownership, the team. That seems to be a one-sided conversation where the player is always supposed to be loyal to the team, but the team may not always be loyal to that player. And to me, that's the definition of a rivalry, right? Like, that butting heads and that always going against each other, and how that plays out. Now, it may not be a specific player versus specific team all the time, but that team versus player dynamic is true for every sport. And so I just thought it was a fun way and a different way of looking at rivalries as a whole to kind of kick off the rivalry conversation.
Yeah. Well, and look, I kind of despise the human being right now, but I mean, like, there is also a very recent case between player and ownership, and that'd be the Houston Texans and Deshaun Watson. And I think that that's a case where you're almost looking at it like, okay, are the Texans front office at fault? Is Watson at fault? Look, I mean, we're not going to peel back that onion, but like that's a true ownership and player rivalry that was budding, between that, with the way Houston handled that, the way they treated their entire media, blocking them out so that they don't even go to practices and anything like that, when that is actually their job, mind you, of actually going to practices and reporting like what's actually going. So thank you for making it impossible for them to do their job, by the way, Houston. So like that's part of it, and maybe that's another sidebar of that. Like you also have ownership and media, like the ownership in the media, and so there are definite rivalries in anything. When you peel back the onion, there are rivalries in life. There's rivalries in sports. I mean, life. Your rivalry is also your worst enemy. I mean, like. If Caleb was, just someone that I like was a nemesis or something, I would consider him a rivalry, in that kind of sense. Like, but also I think rivalries at that same time is misconstrued because
it's not a negative at all times. Absolutely.
And this is where I think it's very easy. This is a nice transition to the players, because Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning is a great example of this. Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, I think people all the time throughout their playing career thought they despised each other. But then when you peeled back the curtain after their playing days, there was actually a lot of admiration from both of them for one another. And I think there's a fair amount of admiration to a certain extent when it comes to player versus player. It's just the person side of it and off the field, they just don't necessarily agree with.
I would say one consistent with all player versus player rivalries, and we'll start talking about some of the great ones, but I would say the one consistent is whether they liked each other or not, whether there was true hate or true friendship, the one consistency within a rivalry is always the respect.
Yeah. And to that point, with that respect, and look, it's actually the same argument for your teammates make you better, rivalries make you better.
Iron sharpens iron. Greatness breeds greatness, right?
Exactly. And so when Tom Brady and look, I actually think there's also like unknown rivalries, I think, in sports. And I think that meaning there's rivalries that we don't necessarily think are rivalries, or there's budding rivalries. Look at right now. I think there's a fair argument right now that the new Peyton Manning and Tom Brady is Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow.
Pinky wanted me to make sure I said that he believes that is the greatest rivalry in the NFL right now.
Right now, I think it's fair. There's probably some other choices, but I think that's a fair argument to be made. But I think that there's also a fair argument that you can have the best case that I could probably make is in baseball on this, but it's just when you have Clayton Kershaw on the mound, right? Who's the ace, or, a Walker Buehler, those aces. And I realize I'm using just the Dodgers, but when you have an upper echelon pitcher or player, Shohei Ohtani, say he's on the mound, and you are a fifth rotation player, or you are a call up, right? Or you're a call-up to the mound, and you're starting that day, and you are basically going, in all intents and purposes, head-to-head versus Shohei Ohtani. People aren't going to be talking about how well you went toe-to-toe with Ohtani for 7 innings and struck out, 10, walked 1, allowed 2 hits, and, shut out. They're going to be talking about, how bad or how good Shohei Ohtani played, with only very few mentioned the fact that you actually went toe-to-toe with maybe the greatest pitcher of all time, or, so on and so forth. Or it's the same thing with quarterback play. And I think that happens a few times where rivalries happen to where it comes from unknown sources, to where it may not be a consistent thing of a rivalry, but you also have a game rivalry in that sense. Where,
absolutely.
Where you have a player that is, like I said earlier, a Shohei Ohtani and someone else. I mean, it's just so like that's that part of that rivalry where it's like just a sole game rivalry.
So here's something else, and this is I'm going to use this example because it's something that I've been on social media arguing against for a solid couple of years now, and it will allow us to kind of branch out from there. So, viewers, I apologize ahead of time. Just stick with me here. You'll understand where we're going. Rivalries have to be born naturally. They cannot be forced. And Cam, I'm hoping you agree with me on this. If you don't, please explain. But Iowa fans are convinced that Iowa and Nebraska is a rivalry because the Big Ten put it in a primetime slot and they are a border states and there's a trophy now. I don't know a single true Nebraska fan that sees Iowa as a rival in any shape, way, or form. But Iowa fans sure believe they're a rival because they've had the better end of those games over the last decade. More power to them. They've been a more consistent program. I'm not going to deny that. But to claim that that's a rivalry just because they're border states and the Big Ten created a trophy for it does not make you a rival. There is no history there to create that rivalry that was born naturally.
I
agree or disagree?
I think it is a rivalry, but I will say, but again, it's not the Colorados of the world. It's not the, it's not the Oklahomas of the world. It's not the K-States.
Miami, Florida State, I would say, is bigger rivals.
It's not.
And that's because of the games that were played on a national level.
And it's not Kansas and Missouri rivalries. It's not anything like that. It's just, I think that when you look at it, I think it depends. See, the best way to have this conversation is with a former player who played with the university. And this is not a Nebraska thing. This is a college football thing in this kind of instance. But a former player, like let's just, for the sake of the argument, and I know people are going to hate this, we're Huskers fans. We'll use this as an example, okay? But like let's just say for the sake of the argument, we sat down and interviewed Johnny Rogers, okay? And we would ask him, do you feel like Iowa is a rivalry? Now, say you sat down with Trey Palmer or you sat down with, someone who has been maybe even a coach for that matter. Like, did you, like, for instance, like say a Bill Bush, who was a recent, person on that staff. Did you feel like that was a rivalry between you and Iowa? You're you may or may not get a different variety of answers. And so
that's a fair point.
And so I think that it's one of those cases where, in my frame of mind, I don't necessarily think it was forced. I think to a certain extent, there's an argument it was going to the Big Ten, its proximity. It certainly makes a lot of sense if they had to make it a rivalry that it would be Iowa, right? And just in how they did it in proximity. But I will say rivalries are, and I will agree with you on this, rivalries are built over time. And I think the way it's become a rivalry now is the way that maybe Nebraska fans, and I hate to say this at times too, is like, and even for Iowa's sake, they're taking it too personally. Now, the fact that they've lost so many games to Iowa, or Iowa has won so many games against Nebraska, right? So I think that for rivalries, I think that Nebraska has now just taken it to an advantage where the rivalry, it didn't start out as one. I will say that. I didn't start out as one. But I think the rivalry was built over time when they kept losing some games and so on and so forth. So I will say that it is a rivalry, but it was built in that sense, like because they lost so many games. And that was the game near the end of the schedule. It was obviously the last game of the season. And so I felt like it was just built over time.
So I understand where you're coming from, and I can respect that that thought process. To me, I look at it and I go, I don't look at our season as being a make or break if we win or lose the Iowa game. To me, a true rivalry is your season can still be a good season if you beat your rival. a la a Michigan State, Ohio, or Michigan, Ohio State, a Bama and Auburn, Florida State, Florida.
Well, let me ask you this then. As a Huskers fan, was the Mickey Joseph year a failure in that sense, or was it actually a nice little capper? The fact that they beat Iowa, and it wasn't actually that they just beat them by one touchdown, or was it the fact that they controlled the lead for the entirety of that game, and that's what made the season sweeter?
So honestly, that game meant nothing to me. As a Nebraska fan, the game meant nothing to me. What I appreciated, though, about that game was the fact that you saw continuous improvement from the time Mickey Joseph took over until the last game of the season, which happened to be Iowa. I liked the direction he had the team going. It's one of those things, though, where the Big Ten has forced that schedule to be Iowa as the last game of the season with Nebraska. I've never felt Iowa as a true competitor. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to Iowa. They've been a solid program.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, another thing that you deal with when you talk about a rivalry is, do both teams have an opportunity to do something special? Right. And I've never looked at Iowa as a team or a program that is going to do something special. Colorado has had some flashes. They have a national title. Now, I've heard from Iowa fans, look, Iowa's got 5 national titles. Yeah, your last one was in 1958. That is technically the only one the NCAA recognizes. The other 4 were like 21, 22, 25, and 30. And the NCAA doesn't recognize any of those ones. So, it's one of those things where the game is played year in and year out, and it doesn't mean anything. And a Big Ten title shot, championship game, is not big enough marbles for me. That winning the West and going to the Big Ten championship game is not a big enough carrot on the end of the stick, if you will, to create that rivalry. It has to be whoever wins or loses this game is going to the Big Ten championship and possibly playing for a national championship. That's the carrot on the stick that I would need to see for that to truly develop into that level.
I mean, it's
Nebraska and Colorado had some of that. Obviously, you mentioned Oklahoma, Nebraska.
Yeah.
And then Nebraska had their battles with the Florida teams in national championship games with Miami and Florida State. Those created a natural rivalry to an extent as well. So I understand why some people may see it as a rivalry, but to me, it's never reached the level required to consider it as such.
Well, I will be the first to tell you, I think it's a rivalry, but it's nowhere even near the Big 12 rivalries that we've had in the past, like nowhere near. Because there's far more memories and far more pleasant memories or disappointing memories, from those years than it is,
because the games meant something, Cam. Right. That's what it came down to. Whether we lost or we won, those games meant something.
Right. So then let me ask you this, to now branch over to the NFL and then with the college game, then what do you feel is the best rivalry from a team-to-team perspective? Is it the team versus team in the NFL or team versus team in the college game?
The college game out-rivals the NFL for rivalries, and it's not even close. I will say, I will agree with Pinky. I think the best rivalry in the NFL right now is Chiefs-Bengals. And that's because they've been playing meaningful games in the playoffs. I think the Bills and Chiefs are a very close second.
Yeah.
If you want to say Bills and Chiefs over Bengals and Chiefs, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm good with either or, however you want to decipher that. But it starts and ends with those two options. I think, and I don't know if this is due to fantasy, if it's due to more free agency movement and things of that nature, but I feel like we could talk about every sport on a whole, but we'll stick to NFL. I believe those rivalries that once existed, to me personally, I believe they no longer exist. Now, if you want to talk about the AFC North as a division, and rivalries and just being just nose to the grind, beat 'em up football games, I'm good with that. But I don't see as much the Pittsburgh versus Baltimore.
Yeah.
And fans of those teams might think differently than I do, but from an outside perspective, I don't see those rivalries being as meaningful, as high level, as intense as they once were. AFC East, Giants Cowboys, Giants Commanders, soon to be something else. Giants and Eagles. The division as a whole, yes, the NFL still, because of their divisions and the way they've set those up for decades, the divisions still have those rivalries within them.
Right.
I just personally, from an outside perspective on those, don't feel that they're as intense as they once were. And as a Broncos fan, I personally believe, and I know there's Raiders at the top of the list of Broncos fans dislike, but I don't feel like the Broncos have ever even truly had a true rival within their own division. I feel like Chiefs and Raiders maybe is a more intense rivalry than even the Broncos and anybody else. So I feel like those natural rivalries that once were have kind of diminished. People always want to talk about Lakers-Celtics. Well, that was only a rivalry because they were playing in the championships for the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That no longer exists, though, in my opinion. So but I think rivalries is absolutely it's historic. Absolutely it is. But when that championship against each other is no longer being played on a regular basis, I think it diminishes over time to the point where I personally believe it's no longer even a rivalry. I believe that's what the NFL has created over time with the parity that I absolutely love. And I think all leagues should model the way the NFL has created parity and a bottom dweller being able to come all the way to the top within, 3 to 5 years. I think it's brilliant. But I think it's also diminished to an extent those natural rivalries that once existed.
So I agree. I think college rivalries are primo compared to the NFL, but I have a different reasoning, and it's continuing your thought. But I think the reason why, and that's again not to say that there are team rivalries in the NFL, but what I love about college rivalries is it actually continues into the NFL. But what the things that I love about it is because of the team rivalries that you've been instilled in ingrained in day one. For instance, right? Like for instance, Michigan and Ohio State, right? But it's just like when it's ingrained in your head to hate that team, right? It goes from team to team rivalries in college to player and player rivalries in the NFL pretty easily. And it goes back to that discussion that we had earlier where rivalries, you have an admiration for the person. You just know, like for instance, I would imagine when Andy Janovich came into the league and Josie Jewell were crossing paths for at least a little bit, that there was some, and this goes back to the Iowa discussion though. Like I would imagine there was some cross between some smack talking going on between the rivalries between both of them in the locker room about, Iowa and, Nebraska and stuff like that. Or even Jake Butt, when Jake Butt was with the Broncos and you had Michigan and you had some of the Ohio State players. But I still think though, like you will see far more player versus player in the NFL, but I think a lot of that has either been generated from their time in college to the pros, or it's just something that has been garnered, through their career in the NFL, right? Like for instance, I don't exactly know specifically what started between Aqib Talib and Michael Crabtree. However, that butted into a rivalry on the field immediately because and that was a physical rivalry because that butted into truly one of the greatest. I'm taking your chain.
Hey, it's on every NFL player. You don't wear a chain around Talib Aqib. You tuck that chain in. You make sure you do not show that to that man.
Right. And I mean, obviously, you would be remiss if you didn't even bring up Aqib Talib and Michael Crabtree with the Bronco fans that we have and stuff like that. So you would be remiss if you didn't bring it up. But I mean, like, so, but again, like, I think it's far more generated to have a player versus player rivalry in the NFL than it is team versus team, because you rarely do see team versus team anymore in the NFL.
Agreed. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think, well, twofold question, so stick with me here. One, do you think rivalries have kind of started to die off a little bit as a fandom because of fantasy? And two, when you talk about fantasy, we're talking about the Bills or the Bengals and the Chiefs. Do rivalries now have to be divisional? But again, going back to that game has to mean something. You have to play at the highest stage consistently for that rivalry to now be considered worth talking about.
I think if there's any rivalry that has to do with fantasy, it has to do with myself, the owner of Call of Duty, my fantasy team name, and the fact that Jerry Jeudy's not producing. That's my rivalry.
But do you think it's lessened fans true loyalty, because it's one of those things where it's like, I want to see my fantasy team do really well, but I want to see my team win. So those games may not be looking at them with the same level of intensity that maybe you once were.
Well, so like from my perspective, I actually look at the game a lot more intently now that I'm in fantasy football, because there's a lot of things that statistic wise I like to follow and stuff like that. But I actually beat it though, and I know I was kidding, but it's like that's like a true rivalry for me, because it's like you get a lot of blowback when you're an athlete on social media of like, a player didn't perform, or you didn't draft this particular player. And so that's actually the rivalry in terms of fantasy, is the player wasn't drafted by you, therefore he's a little upset by it and kidding us. Those are playful rivalries.
Sure.
Those are playful rivalries. But so I don't know. I think just overall from the rivalry standpoint, it's still definitely it's more built over time, and that's one of the reasons why the Bengals and the Chiefs are the primo rivalry next to the Bills and Chiefs, because what has been the most consistent AFC championship we've seen in the last few years, it's the Bills and the Chiefs. It happened twice, and that's why a lot of people are saying that it is the basic rivalry that we've seen, and also some of the best games that we had seen.
Absolutely
have happened.
Here's another thought to throw this in there for you as well, and I believe this has a lot to do with it personally. The culture has developed this very much championship or bust mindset. The NBA is notorious for it. Kevin Durant is a prime example of taking a lot of heat for the way he's gone about his career. I feel like that's also been a detriment to rivalries as a whole, and diminishing, your in-division rivalries, your in-conference rivalries, things of that nature. What do you feel about that championship or bust mentality from the public perspective, that idea that if it's not on that level, it's not a rivalry either?
But are you also going to the level of, if I'm not seeing this on my or value on this particular team, I'll jump ship to this particular team? Is that kind of like what?
It could be that as well. I'm just thinking more along the lines of going back to that. If the game isn't on a big level, like if you're looking at Washington at 13, and they're playing the Giants a couple years back at 7-9, do those fan bases still really consider that a rivalry, or are they just like, oh hum, it's a division game, neither one of us are in the playoffs? Or are they looking at it like, man, if we beat them, I'm still ecstatic. I'm still loving the fact that our season still meant something because we beat our rival. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know. That one you'd have to be there, like actually in the locker room, for you to actually experience something like that. because
not from a player perspective, but from a fan outside looking in perspective. My team beat your team. Does it still hold that same weight?
Well, it depends. So, like if you're 14-3 the last 5 years, but the game you've always lost, like for instance, New England and Miami. Miami had always kind of had New England's number, and I would say that through a course of a few years, that was a rivalry to me from an outsider's fan perspective, because it seemed like every year, every other year, the game that New England would always falter with was Miami. And so I think that, for that argument, it would depend on the rivalry. So if like you're 14-3 every single year and you're losing to that team, the Giants, at 7-9, or what is it, 7-10 now every year, but that's the team you always lost to, then I would consider it a rivalry. For instance, the Jacksonville Jaguars with the Denver Broncos of the 90s. If that was a consistent theme, I could have seen that being a little bit of a budding rivalry.
Sure.
The Thunder disagreed with me, apparently. But
yes.
but no, I think it's one of those cases where, like, if you are 14-3, but you're losing to that particular team every season or every other season, I can definitely see that being a rivalry from a fan's perspective, because that's the game you feel like where you have to get over the hump, where you actually feel like, okay, we have to beat this team. Like, like in order to maybe feel good about the season, or, where like this just feels like the monkey off our back in terms of the regular season, and so, but at the same time, it's like, so here's a case where like you're losing to this team every other year or every year, and you're 14-3, but you win the Super Bowl, then it's not going to matter.
Right. Exactly. So we'll end it on this. We'll get our thoughts here. What do you consider the greatest rivalry in all of sports? All of sports. And we're talking throughout history, your Yankees, your Red Sox, Duke, Carolina, Michigan, Ohio State. Thinking about the whole big picture, every sport, Lakers, Celtics. What would you say, in your opinion, is the greatest rivalry in all of sports right now? Not in history, but right now.
Yeah, it's hard. And those are hard questions because it's pretty subjective, I mean, I wouldn't say it's objective, but it's pretty subjective, and so I think that for my sake and, everything that I've seen, I will go a step further, and I will actually give you two. I will go my favorite rivalry from a team perspective is probably Michigan and Ohio State. It's Michigan and Ohio State, or Texas and Oklahoma. Texas and Oklahoma, I think, has lost its rivalry a little bit with the Red River shootout.
Rivalry, sure.
But I don't necessarily. So, but it's probably top two for me as far as my favorite rivalries. But I would say Michigan and Ohio State is probably that rivalry for me. Baseball is the Red Sox and the Yankees. And then in terms of player versus player, the best player versus player rivalry that I can recall is Peyton versus Brady.
Okay. I like that. I will actually say Duke, North Carolina is the best rivalry right now. And the reason I give it a slight edge over Michigan, Ohio State is because it's twice a year. And sometimes three, because they can end up in the ACC championship game.
Or national championship.
So the fact that you get that intensity more than once, that's why I will give that a slight edge. Michigan State and Ohio State is second, as much as I don't want to say that. It just is.
Especially
I will.
I was just going to say, especially the way Harbaugh has now officially turned the tables on it. And like
Definitely.
I think at one point, so here's a case where I still probably would have said Michigan and Ohio State, even with all the success that Urban Meyer and Ryan Day had.
Agreed.
But then that just goes to the luxury and the history of Michigan, Ohio State. But the fact that Harbaugh has truly flipped the tables of Michigan, Ohio State now, truly has me saying Michigan, Ohio State in terms of just best, overall rivalry for me.
I like that. I will say the best player versus player in our lifetime. I will give Brady and Manning the slight edge, but I think a very close second. And depending on what happens the next couple of years, it could possibly overtake it. I think Steph LeBron is underrated as a player versus player rivalry because of what they've done on the biggest stage. They played in championships against each other, where Manning and Brady were playing against conference against each other. So I think LeBron and Steph is slightly underrated in the player versus player category all time. And we're about to witness the end of that too. So we are lucky enough in our lifetimes to see some all-time great player versus player rivalries.
Yeah, and then the current rivalry, as we all know, for basketball's sake, is going to go from Steph Curry and LeBron to Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid.
It can't go again. It can't, Cam. I almost brought it up, but I decided against it, and this is why. Embiid doesn't play in Denver. And if Embiid keeps ducking Denver, we can't call it a rivalry because he's obviously scared. And you can't be a rival if you're scared to play the other guy.
We went a whole show without bringing up Nikola Jokic. And
I like the transition.
Yeah,
Cam, as always, it is an absolute pleasure chopping it up with you, my guy. I appreciate you being able to fill in for Pinky this evening. I hope you have a wonderful night. And everybody, as always, do not waste those opportunities with your loved ones, family, friends, anybody in your inner circle. Take advantage of it. Never waste it. Love y'all. Appreciate the support. We're out.
Even when you feel low, you can still go. Even when you feel slow, you can still go. Even when there's no hope, you can still go. I never answer to no, man, I still